keep being jogged in the elbow by our guests who all know him so well, and have actually known him, a lot of you, for considerably longer than I have. You will already have read and studied very thoroughly indeed, or you're in deep trouble, on Leopold IV and Fritz.
Thousands of years by its tribal communities. When the Egyptian pharaohs sent emissaries into Africa, they parleyed with African tribal chiefs. And when the colonial powers of Europe invaded that vast continent, so vast, you can get England into the Sahara Desert 60 times. The vastness is part of the reasons for its, the way it has developed. They set up boundaries which simply reflected their rival colonial ambitions, which took no account whatsoever of the tribal affiliations of the people they presumed to rule, and for a mere 100 years of those 1,000 years established these fragile eggshell nations which now exist and which are increasingly in deep water as tribal relationships and affinities, traditions, loyalties and everything are rising more and more to the surface. And I venture to think that Africa will never, never know peace. It will never know any kind of stability nor any kind of progress until its government is back in the hands of its tribal peoples. And that is, so when I was invited by the Litunga of Barotseland to act on his behalf in London some years ago, I regarded it as one of the greatest honours that I could undertake, and I was delighted to accept it, and my only regret is I've not been able to do more to justify my position with it. So that's by way of an explanation of something that may have puzzled you. Now, I was in Japan in July. I was invited to give the keynote address at a conference, alternative conference at People's Summit. And while I was there, I'm not going to talk about Japan. In fact, I'm trying not to make a speech. I always tell people of these occasions, the time when I made a speech at a big dinner, and a man came bowling up to me afterwards and said, "That was the most boring speech I ever heard in my life. I think the committee was mad to invite you here, and I've half a mind to resign from the association in protest." And the chairman came along and took him away, and when he came back he said, "You know, John, you mustn't take any notice of old Charlie. When he's drunk, he just goes around repeating what he hears everybody else say." But while I was in Japan, for like relief, I was reading a novel by Ian Forster. It was called The Longest Journey. It was set in the period of the first decade of the 20th century, 1910 onwards sort of. And it was a very elusive kind of novel. It's almost a kind of art form. And I think you find it sort of spelled out rather more fully by people like Kingsley Amis, and even more by his son, Martin Amis. But what struck me reading this novel about the love-hate relationships of different people, the form of dress they wear. One lady was far too tired when she came in the room, far too tired to remove her veil, and reminding me of, was it Burke who said he could never understand why people should go hungry for dinner when they had only to ring the bell. You know, you find yourself asking, could those people see what was coming? In 1911, 1912, couldn't they see that what they were encountering was the biggest catastrophe in human history? As a war, a global war, which tore the guts out of Western civilization and made the tragedies of Hitler and Stalin and all the rest of it possible. Couldn't they see it coming? And the answer is no. Well, it's very easy to be wise after the event, isn't it? And we're wise after that event. But that comes into my head is, can we see what's coming? And I think that A, we've got the experience of the past to go on, and B, surely we have enough awareness of the different trends that are making for the way events are shaping to take on board and ask ourselves, what is coming? And if what is coming is so awesome, what are we doing about it? What should we do about it? And I live today under an increasing sense of a sort of sense of inadequacy. That here we are, running into a crisis, one we've already run into, where whatever aspect of our lives you look at, whether we're looking at the resources, we're finite resources, we're using up as though there's no tomorrow, no future generation to worry about, whether it's the way we're polluting the soil, the air, the water of the planet, treating it, and even as Schumacher used to say, treating all our capital as income, the way we're disintegrating localized communities, making our social structures top-heavy, increasingly dangerous. I was in Nagasaki while I was in Japan, and we did a pilgrimage there. And you know, in some ways, those bombs dropped on Japan were the supreme crime of all crimes. They opened a new moral dimension to human experience. Just think of it. I stood there where that bomb had dropped. Now it's just a square of gravel with a statue of the Buddha at one end. Kids are running around catching butterflies with little nets and eating ice cream. 11 o'clock on that particular morning, 1,200 kids were at work in their school. There was a big prison. Prisoners were being marshalled to be taken to court. There was an enormous Catholic cathedral with a couple of dozen penitents queuing up to make their confessions and to get absolution for their sins. And suddenly, nothing. They weren't there. Just like that. You may ask yourself the whys and the wherefores and all the rest of it. And in those days, only 2 or 3 nations had the bomb. Today, that number is over 20 and is growing all the time. And we're confronted with a situation where armaments is not a dangerous, contagious field. It's being controlled and governed in every way by responsible human governments to ensure that their use is not abuse. If you can think they can never be used without being abused. Instead, they are pawns in a global market. People are free to run around the world to buy and sell these things, to design them, get them made, so on and so on. Weapons that are biological, gas, nerve gas, atomic, nuclear, whatever you like. Wasn't it Shaw who said a nation armed and prepared for war can no more help going to war than a chicken can help lay an egg? Now, in the paper that I've written, I tried to draw attention to what seems to me something quite crucial to where we are today. And you know, if I may say this, I think this gathering has its own place in history. This academic inn talking about the theories of Leopold Kohr and Fritz Schumacher. And if you may feel that in paragraph 30 of my paper, I say something which may cause a great deal of dissension. Just let me remind you what it says. I'm saying the radical movement today, for all its dedication in espousing great causes of peace, freedom and justice, and ecological sanity is intellectually bankrupt. It can go on holding lectures, courses, conferences and seminars. It can go on publishing books, journals, pamphlets and leaflets, or on organising petitions and staging demonstrations until their activists are ready to drop, and it will achieve nothing. Repeat, nothing in the vital matter of arresting the global crisis unless and until it grasps the significance of the overriding importance of the factor of scale in relation to its concerns. And I make no apologies for being so adamant in what I'm saying there. I think that we are in a situation today where, in a matter of a decade or so, the chief problem confronting any one of us is not going to be whether we've said our prayers this morning or whether we've got enough petrol to get from here to there or anything else. It's going to be where the next meal is coming from. I think we're on the verge of a breakdown of civilized society which has no parallel in history, and which I think at least one of the authors that I'm referring to in my paper is showing with the utmost clarity a way in which we will avoid that possibility. And I have to just add this. You know, it does seem to me we're letting the grass grow under our feet. We are not achieving anything of substance in arresting the global crisis. We've had these wonderful demonstrations in Seattle against the multilateral agreement on investment and these people who are trying to clamp down people's liberties in order to make all human life subservient to conditions of trade, of which they are the controllers and the chief beneficiaries. We've had these demonstrations against the Euro plot in Britain, and be amazed how many people have swallowed the propaganda that united Europe as a Europe of peace and progress and all this sort of things, only too likely to be reversed. But still, you get the sense that the values on which our societies are based are still flooding our consciousness. Just think how children's minds are affected, the way television intrudes into the home, reaches over the barriers of parental control to saturate children's minds with the values of consumerism. I saw, you know, in the light of the furore that's going on about the future of those two lads who killed a little boy so abominably some years ago, a little toddler. I thought of the scene you can see in any city today, any major city, of a child no more than 10, perhaps even younger, standing in front of a machine that's equipped with guns, pointing at a screen and pulling the trigger in order to kill the figures and make them explode on the screen. What are we putting into children's heads? What we're indicating here, I think, is in this small way, it's one more indication that our societies are no longer rational, they're no longer reasonable, they're no longer sensible, they're no longer moral, but they're all the obverse of these things and getting worse and worse week by week. Well, if you look at any current magazine, you'll find a list of events. A list of events about, you know, let's have deep consciousness about this, or let's have a campaign to stop hot hunting, or let's go for a rodent therapy. You know, that's going to help a lot, isn't it? And so on and so on. And nowhere do you see any attempt to grapple, nowhere, with the actual nuts and bolts, not of the consequences of the global crisis, but of the causes of it. And if we can't get clarity in our heads about what has caused the global crisis, which for me is spelt out by Leopold Kohr so eloquently, in terms of the factor that the mere fact that scale has broken down because it's become so enormous that no longer is anything under control. So that anybody, you can guarantee anybody who gets into number 10 Downing Street, however big a parliamentary job, you can guarantee within 6 months he will be an object of hatred and execration. Because he's grappling with a situation which is utterly beyond anybody's capacity to control for rational, social purposes at all. So, I'm going to stop there. All I just want to say is just this. You know, where are the conferences? Where are the study groups? Where are the commissions to establish on human scale terms a peace plan for Ireland, for Palestine? Where is all this activity? Because this is what is needed. This is what is lacking. Thank you.
And then I invite you to read it.
Only we did not have a market economy. And our lives are dominated by a market economy, and the problem we're confronted with is what to do about that market economy, how to control it, and how to make sure it works for the common interest rather than for the benefit of those who are at the top of it. You know, it really doesn't help anything forward by just simply reiterating what people felt about land and the air and everything before a market economy existed. We're prisoners of it now. Our problem is how to resolve our imprisonment.
I'd like to interrupt quite firmly before that carries forward to say that it seems to me that the universal values of our natural, God-given, depending on who your God is and what your God is, given environment, and that we are of it. And the very act of calling it an environment, as if it was something separate from us, is whether that's part of our market economy, whether it's the point at which the value of the land is something separate from its inherent value as our mother. And I think it seems to me that whether we're talking about a market economy or anything else, it seems to be absolutely fundamental that we hold that value true. And that in that sacred land, well, we could just get back a little bit towards this, and then the whole horizon might change dramatically. Because if we actually said that the air that we breathe and the water that we drink hasn't got a price, it's priceless. It's beyond.
But in a market economy, it does have a price. This is our tragedy.
The point is, and I have a very strong feeling, being in the currently very fashionable organic food production world, I'm very anxious, very anxious indeed to back away from the market. I'm very uncomfortable with this sort of marketing hype of organic food, supermarkets taking up as sort of, latest thing that we all want to be in. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the latest thing I've got to be out of. I'm not interested in marketing at all. I'm interested in producing food for people to eat in what is and I completely endorse what Eric said. And again, back to what John was saying about the spiritual, as far as I'm concerned, what we need to identify and define in some way, and I'm finding people doing it, is a right sort of, and it sounds awfully eco-nala, but the eco-spirituality is, I think, what it has to be. I mean, there's a sort of spirituality, not with Christianity or to do with humans and the planet on which we live and our relationship with it, and it's nothing to do with markets, and we must actually work away from these markets, because it's not all to do with markets. Of course they control everything at the moment, but as far as I'm concerned, there is no price for my land. And I mean, I am a landowner, and I do not want to have Henry Georgites come along and tell me I've got to pay X amount of tax on this land. I want to coexist with other people in relation to that land, and maybe I don't think it's important that I own it at all. I think what is really important is what happens there. And if I'm required to pay tax on it, I will extract the maximum revenue from it I can. But I don't do that. There are areas which are totally, a developer's dream on my land, and they can bugger off as far as I'm concerned.
reply to that. I'd like to reply to that. This rent of the land, as seen by Henry George, is a return to the community. And when the whole thing has been shifted, the burden has been shifted from individuals, all other things like commodities would also change their prices. So that you say you don't want to have an additional tax on the land, but you would not have a tax on all the other things that were on top of the land. So there would be no tax on your house or your crops or anything like that.
Would it be okay for
Pay
you?
on the land?
Would it be okay for you for the Indian government to have a taxation system in terms of your Henry George philosophy?
The Indian government?
For example, or the Russian government, or the
Yes,
American government?
yes, why not?
Yes. Why not? Because it's too big, dear. It's out of control. That's why not.
But what about all the other means of production?
Can I come back to this one? We've got one who keep dying to say something.
The market is a biological process. If there's a surplus of rabbits, there's a demand for foxes. This is a market. So it is wholly biological, the market.
Markets are buying and selling.
It becomes complicated by, this is a mere extension of the natural market process. And the problem we have today is big government, because big government necessarily means big business who try to get round the
Big war.
And without that big government, the big business would have to reduce their size. So if we demolish the welfare state, which of course is all about the big government, then the big companies, etc., would not find it as profitable as the smaller companies, because small, you can then relate to the owner of the firm. In a big firm you cannot, and this relationship is an advantage economically. So once you can do away with the big government, which is the welfare state, you do away with the big business, and businesses would come down to kind of 1,000 people per firm. For instance, a firm making cars, all the owner need have is 1,000 people to organise where the bits are made and where all the bits are assembled, and that they could all be separate companies, so that you could reduce the bid size that way.
Right, I'm going to be a dissident voice on this case. I don't think scale is the problem. But I think the analysis, at the end, the way he put it, he said that it's a crisis of power, is the problem. That doesn't stem from scale. And I agree with John Gordon, that all institutions are the same. I absolutely agree with that. It doesn't matter what it is or what scale it is. It can be a government of the states, the government of this country, it can be a parish council, it can be a farm, it can be a family, it can be a school, it can be a company. They're all the same. All institutions behave the same. And they acquire their own characteristics and power develops within them. And that's the problem. So the analysis that John Hapgood put out here, the end point is a crisis of power, right? Causally to the scale. And another point from 25 is how to tame power and how to make it susceptible to human control. And your analysis says, or your solution says, the way you tame power and make it susceptible to control is to reduce the scale. Okay, that's one way. I don't think that's the way to do it. Sometimes you need scale. As you take, we all benefit from certain material things like computer chips, for example.
Do we?
There are some benefits to some of that.
Is that right?
Yes, there are some. I don't disagree with mobile phones or whatever, but there are some benefits. But you shouldn't
shouldn't knock all technology, but sometimes you need scale. Sometimes you use scale to deal with climate problems. Right? We can't deal with climate problems at this point in time just at local level. So I think the scale issue is wrong. The power analysis is right. Now, the thing is, an earlier discussion said how to deal with power, and it's the trusteeship concept as opposed to ownership that will deal with it. Right? And I think you said is in my land, I want to decide that it's what happens as a court. That's absolutely right. It's what happens in every organisation is what matters. So the scale of it is what happens that matters. Sometimes you need big organisations to deal with problems, sometimes you need small organisations. Who decides? Who has the power? And how's that power accounted for? And that's the issue.
I think you're wrong. It's not a crisis. It isn't a crisis of power. It's a crisis of large-scale power. Small-scale power. The parish council isn't threatening the world. Large-scale power does threaten the world. And when you talk about climate change needing large groups or whatever, it doesn't. It needs expert groups, which can be very small. I mean, for instance, if you're deciding, I don't know, postal standards or fax standards for the whole world, you don't need to have a big bureaucracy or the United Nations or whatever. You just have an expert group gets together and reports back to their parliaments or whatever. It doesn't. All these things can be dealt with on an ad hoc basis. You don't need Brussels. You don't need.
Well, sometimes you do. What I'm suggesting.
Well, I think almost all the time you don't. Even for making chips, you don't need Brussels. It can be done small scale.
Well, whatever the argument of scale is, instead of John writing here that tame power, right, and so on, because I think the golden life is to dissolve power.
Whatever else you're using, all property.
That's part of the George's
But the minute, you see, I think that it's a 19th century mind frame which assumes that you can pick up one aspect of the complexities of human society and say, now, if we change that round, we'll solve all the problems. Well, you won't, because you can't. Human life doesn't respond like that. There's no way you can guarantee that if people do pay their taxes in one way rather than another, that they will behave differently in other respects. There's no guarantee at all. All one can say is, here I really am going to stop. All one can say is that if the thing is so big that you can't control it, that's where we are in this stage in 20th century, 21st century, then whatever your moral and value judgments may be, they're irrelevant to the progress that's going on, the progress of events. That what matters is that they should be of such a measure, such a scale, that your moral judgments do matter, that you do have some effect on what's going on. And I did spell it out in my paper, that if you're a member of a community of 4,000, you've got a 4,000 share, plus the fact that in every aspect of human activity, there is a role of leadership. I'm not very comfortable with this idea about hierarchy so much, because there are different kinds of leadership. I'm exercising right now a particular kind of leadership, but everybody around this table is able to exercise something of leadership in some sphere or other. Get on with it, this is all I'm saying. Thank you.
Well, that ends the formal part. If you want to carry on with the discussion, by all means do so amongst us.
Extinction of either the leaders themselves or their national independence, or both. Yet there must always appear to be a door to salvation, open to them should they reverse course. The fear should be compelling, but not paralyzing.
It's gunboat diplomacy, in other words. Anybody want to make a comment on that?
What was that question?
Well, I'm just saying, really, that this is the kind of power that makes not only the ordinary people, but most leaders pretty well helpless to do anything, because they know that that sort of threat will be used against them. There was a book written by Claude Mayer after the war. He was the head of the CIA, called Peace or Anarchy. And in that book he said, well, we'll have a federal government of the world, and if any nation disobeys it, it will be blown off the face of the earth. It's all very well to laugh at it, but I mean, we are more or less in that position at the moment. Another passage from this, which I quoted in the editorial, is in